Welcome to E-Pathshala. You are in EPG program in Japanese and the paper is Communication Through Translation. We'll be taking up module 1, that is translation traditions of this paper, and the module ID is JPN_P05_M01. This is Ashok Chawla. I am Chief Scientist and Head Translation Division at CSIR Nisker, New Delhi. I also go to APU Japan as visiting professor and as visiting faculty to JNU in New Delhi. Let me talk about the communication through translation. Normally the communication takes place through some medium, that could be language, that could be letter, but in any case the language is the prime requisite there. It is when the language is not known, then we need the translation. So the topic here is we use the translation as the mode or medium of communication. Before we go into the communication through translation, let me talk about history and traditions of translation. You'll ask, why is it important to talk about history and traditions? It is important to understand the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure, the behavior, and the application of different elements related to the domain of translation. It goes without saying that the gradual developments of human civilization from the ancient to modern era, as understood in general, must have witnessed minor to massive intercultural and interlingual communication around the globe, even though certain vital connecting elements such as what modes of travel, communication, interaction, and translation were in practice in those days. This is yet to be established in foolproof manner. Further, there could be no denial that in the past the need for translation from one language to another has always been felt for general and cultural communication between two or more communities and to some extent for commercial dealings. One very well-known example is the dealings and transactions along the Silk Road route involving India, China, and other countries. Things used to be very smoothly done when the material was passing from China via Tibet to India or to other countries. According to the information that has been gathered so far, the oldest translation dates back to the 3rd century BC. It is actually difficult to say whether that was the first translation, but that is the translation on which or for which the data could be collected. The translation activity since then indicates that an in-depth study of history and traditions of translation in different parts of the world is absolutely necessary, which in turn should throw more light on the development path itself, because the development took place when the translation happened, when the communication happened. Now, this is a slide which shows you the tracking of past translations and the communication that took place through this activity. Now let's see, there were some translations which were mentioned in the previous slide. Let's take one by one. Translation of the collection of Jewish scriptures into early Koine Greek in Alexandria by 72 different translators even before the birth of Christ in 300 to 200 BC. This speaks of the organized activity that the translation used to be in those days. When more than 70 different translators are working together, there are issues of dividing the work, of uniforming the vocabulary, and to some extent even the expressions. This means the science of translation probably was in place in those days even. First documented translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese in 148 AD. Though the translation of Buddhist scriptures and even Christianity in China is seen at later date also, but attempt at this level was also made. The next goes the Kumarjiva translated Buddhist text written in Sanskrit into Chinese in 401 to 413 AD. Now here starts actually, these are some of the documents where the records are available, though not in full form, but to some extent connectable form. This is another document translated by a Chinese scholar. It is Yoga Karbhumi Sastra in 645 to 650 AD. Then in 651 to 660 AD, another document is translated, and again 661 to 664 AD, another document is translated. Now, if you see here carefully, it shows that the activity has been going on for more than a decade, which obviously means that it was sponsored by state or by some community which was quite interested in this domain. Now, medical writings in Greek, which was lost to Europe during its dark ages, that is between 5th and 14th centuries, was regained through translations by Huyan into Syriac and Arabic. Then Huyan translated the works of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Hippocrates, and so on. Now, this also very clearly shows that this activity between 808 to 873 AD is a pretty long term when translation was happening in an organized manner. Now, coming forward with regard to the history of translation, in 1418, Oja was the first to translate Sanskrit Ramayana into Bengali. This is followed by a translation in 1522 of New Testament by Martin Luther. Now, if we go further down, Mullah Ahmad partially translated Rajat Rangini into Farsi and also adopted Mahabharata into Farsi, but he couldn't complete it. It was later on completed by Mullah Abdul Qadir Bukaini in 1594. Then Dara Sikon completed the translation of 52 Upanishads with the help of several Pandits from Banaras. Apart from the Upanishads, Dara, with the help from Sanskrit scholars, translated into Persian two other classics of Indian spirituality, the Bhagavad Gita and the Yog Vashisht in 1657. Then first Bible translation from Hebrew and Greek into Tamil. This comes in 1715. Then we have translation of Shakuntalam in English. This was done by William Jones in 1789. And Max Muller translated Rigveda in 1849 to 1874. This continues, and Weber translates then into German Pratiksha in 1858. In continuation, in 1860s to 1880s, there were few translations which could be traced, and one of these was by Whitney. He translated Atharveda Pratisakya into English in 1862. This was followed by a very interesting work, an interesting initiative, where the complete translation of Mahabharata into English was done by Pandit Kesari Mohan Ganguly in 1893. We could actually not lay hand on the original document, but I think this, what you see here, is the reprint in a very good form, which probably is printed after 1900 only, or maybe quite close to this period. Well, this might just be a coincidence that most of these translations are in the domain of social religion, philosophy, and traditional science streams practically. There was not much with regard to science, with regard to very concrete domains, for example, optics or computer, or well, people do say that those fields were not so developed at that time, but quite a bit of information is available in various sources, but the translations were not so easily available. It is quite probable to say that the records of the translations of other popular works might be difficult to track, or it could be a case of what is popularly called plagiarism today. But there is no doubt that the tradition of translation goes back to the history of ancient era. Well, this might just be a coincidence that most of these translations are in the domain of social religion, philosophy, and traditional science streams practically. there was not much with regard to science, with regard to very concrete domains, for example, optics or computer or well, people do say that those fields were not so developed at that time, but quite a bit of information is available in various sources, but the translations were not so easily available. It is quite probable to say that the records of the translations of other popular works might be difficult to track, or it could be a case of what is popularly called plagiarism today. But there is no doubt that the tradition of translation goes back to the history of ancient era. The Rootless Encyclopedia of Translation Studies is a good document that describes various things about various traditions and regarding translation. According to this document, China has witnessed translation and interpreting activities over 3000 years ago. The major Chinese translation works have always been in the government and in the commerce domain. Major translation activities in China appear to have gained momentum during the period when Buddhism was getting spread. It was more and more people were adopting it, or maybe it was because of some efforts by the state or by some temple to spread the Buddhism. The translation of Buddhist sutras in the first wave from Sanskrit into Chinese can be divided into three phases. The second wave included religious translations by missionaries in the late 16th centuries. Further, they translated jointly with Chinese scholars and officials in the field of mathematics, astronomy, geography, physics, and religion. Now, this clearly shows that the missionaries, they started the translation or such activities with religion first, and then gradually tried to bring in science and the knowledge of other domains also. Third wave was led by native intellectuals and was spearheaded by political reformists Kang and Liang in place of official or foreign translators in the field of politics and sociology. This included translation of Western works in 1890s, but the remarkable thing here is that if you see the second wave, it was the missionaries doing the translation from one domain to the other domain. There was a shift. And in the third, the translation spread outside the missionaries. That means the people, the intellectuals, the individuals started participating in it. These are following. Phase 1, it's word-to-word translation adhering to source language syntax. And in the phase 2, the syntactic inversions were smoothened according to target language and polished to produce higher grade literary quality. The sutra translation, it is said, was done by expert foreign monk Chinese translators who did not require interpreters. Coming into the phase 3, the approach changed. The approach to translation was largely dominated by Xuanzang, who advocated that attention must be paid to the original style. He laid the rules for the use of transliteration. In the last few slides, we talked about Chinese traditions in translation. Let's move to Japanese traditions. Being close to China and the language was another factor, another common factor. There were some commonalities between the language. In the Japanese traditions, the first thing is the Chinese script made its entry into Japan in the 3rd and 4th century AD through the Korean scribes who used to copy documents in the pre-printing times. It was initially used among the elites to phonetically write Japanese words, and sometimes the meanings were borrowed. By the 8th century, 2 indigenous phonetic scripts were developed, which enabled Japanese to be written without recourse to Chinese characters also. Till 19th century, Chinese and Japanese existed as 2 media used for scholarly and literary purposes, respectively, but at the same time, there was a certain amount of interplay between the 2 traditions, resulting in a form of Japanized Chinese and Sinicization of Japanese. And then came the May 4th movement. It increased the importance of Western writings in both original and translated forms to install a new culture in China. Translators were self-trained, and the translation domain followed local needs and the dictates. Self-trained means uh, there are no evidences to show that there were institutions to train translators at this stage. It is after the Chinese Revolution of 1911 that the organized and concerted efforts were made to train the government officials in the field of translation. In fact, simultaneous interpreters training program was started during this period around 1970s in Hong Kong. That included the bachelor's degree uh, in translation. The period saw a fusion of Japanese, Chinese, and Western styles. Translation of European poetry brought new forms and techniques such as rhyme in Japanese poetry, which had strict conventions with regard to the use of syllables. And by 1920, major works had been translated, and more important works were being translated in the year of publication itself. Three strands of translation, namely the socialist and communist literary works, surrealist and consciousness works, and the American literary works, could be seen during this period. However, the rise of militarism led to censorship, and American literature declined in popularity. Coming to the post-war, the Allied occupation created a new demand for translators and interpreters, and works that were not published during censorship period came into prints now. And American literature was translated as the mainstream Western literature. In 1970s, management books and how to do type of books were translated also. Film dubbing, subtitling, and children's books, these were also the new areas that saw the translations. With the introduction of Christianity around 16th century, translation of Christian words began, and a major problem in finding equivalents for the new concepts such as God, angel, and cross was found. There existed Tsuji who translated documents related to trade, medicine, natural science, military science, and lastly, humanities. The examples of equivalents mentioned here, for example, God, angel, they are in the field of non-science areas. But as the science comes in, again the problem of equivalence must have been there. In the case of Japanese, help of Chinese characters was taken, and initially they were transcribed into the characters. Thereafter, some of those words were actually transliterated also. In the Meiji period, opening up of Japan brought thoughts and institutions of the West. Again, Chinese words were used to coin new words for the new concepts, which also led to the distortion and a degree of incomprehensibility at times. This is what I just mentioned a while ago, that when the new terms in the new domain came in, the scholars found it easier to use the Chinese characters to describe those concepts. But if we see today's Japanese terminology, then we'll find that some of those characters, they still exist. Some of those words still exist. But the new or the transliterated words have taken their place also. And the present approach. Now this is quite interesting that in Japan, various steps or various methodologies have been used in the past. Still, it can be said that there is no full-fledged or elaborate theory of translation, and it prefers discussion of specific problems to abstract theorizing. Today, the literal approach is more popular and is equated to faithful translation, while free translation is seen in a negative light. Maybe this could be because of the manual-based work philosophy in Japan. Japanese have the habit of practicing a particular methodology. This may be developed domestically, or this may be brought from outside. But once that method is used, they have the concept of Kaizen, that means improve upon that method. And once the method is improved, then standardization is done, then manuals are prepared, and ultimately you reach a level where the degrees of quality is pretty high, and everybody is expected to follow that manual. The consequence is that it becomes a literal translation, which is considered a faithful translation. Regarding machine translation, I can recall 1970s or maybe early 1980s when machine translation was at a peak in Japan. Everybody was talking about machine translation. Companies were funding the projects in machine translation. There is no denial that the standardization and application with regard to machine translation has been done in a very big way in Japan. But if we talk of the application of machine translation, probably it is difficult to say that the machine translation has been successful. In fact, if we look at today's Google translation, Google's machine translation, probably private companies will not venture into further investment into the machine translation now. So all that has been done, or all that has been input by the Japanese companies or by the Japanese government as concerted efforts, that has become a talk of the past now. And now the machine translation is available, but it's available for specific purposes only. In Japan, translation is normally done in a manual way only. But when we talk of traditional translation and interpretation, it is very clear that in Japan the standards are very high. People who do this activity, they are highly professional, and they perform the activity in a very faithful manner and in a very professional manner. By now I think you must all be cleared that the Chinese traditions was a main factor which influenced Japan when it comes to translation. Language, of course, was influenced. Buddhism came from China. So there were certain concepts traveling, the language traveling, and the traditions traveling. And as you all know, by now have got a hint, the translations were originating in the temples, missionaries, such places. So in Japan, the language as well as translation activities were influenced by Chinese traditions in more than one way. The tradition of translation in Japan can be traced back probably to introduction of Buddhism. This is from the available records, it can be said so, from China through Korea. China was in fact too close to Japan, and it is difficult to say whether this statement is correct or not. But since the clear evidence of transfer of translation or the tradition of translation is available during this period only, so we can say at least that this period contributed a lot to the transfer of translation through Buddhism or using Buddhism as the domain from China to Japan. Exchanges and the translation during Dutch and Portuguese interactions had the objective of getting the know-how and technology from the West through a very controlled inflow and restricted exposure. This was a period when the politics, the strategy can be seen in a very clearly defined manner in Japan. Technology was required. People were invited to come and do business in Japan. Together with that business came the knowledge, the know-how that required expertise in translation. And scholars of various fields were put into translation. It is very difficult to say if during that period some trainings were imparted to these people, because they were the scholars, they were the leaders of their domain. Would they agree to undergo some training? Would there be people available to impart training to them? Is a big question mark. So probably they themselves took upon the responsibility of translating, learning the techniques and doing the translation. And some of the works of this period clearly show that the efforts were fantastic. At the end, I would like to sum up that the history and traditions in any domain give an insight or a true insight, and thus must be glanced in a very rational manner. Nevertheless, it can never be denied that the cross-cultural exchange of literature probably became possible only through translation. Scope of history of translation is very vast, and many important literary translations cannot be traced easily with clear channels and the processes. This includes transfer of Ramayana from India to Malaysia, or transfer of Buddhist scripts from India to China, Korea and Japan, and so on. Therefore, only few important milestones of history of translation have been covered in this chapter. As regards Chinese traditions, it indicates clearly that the Chinese language has come a long way, starting from word-to-word translation. Then there must have been various steps in between, but they call it 3-stage only, that is word-to-word, and resulting finally into a meaningful value-added translation. In Japan, language as well as translation activities were influenced by Chinese traditions in many ways. Tradition of translation in Japan can be traced back to introduction of Buddhism from China through Korea. Exchanges and translations during Dutch and Portuguese interactions had the objective of getting the know-how as well as the technology from the West. This was done in a very controlled manner. That means the inflow was controlled, while the exposure was also restricted. That means only select people were given exposure to the foreigners, and the foreigners were also allowed inside Japan, but only in a restricted manner. Next is the war period. I don't think if anybody can say that the translation was not at peak during this period, because it is during the war and in the preceding period, translation activities may not be recorded, or they might not have been made public. This should have been at peak, enabling Japan to set and reach the targets precisely. It was not the technology alone, it was the information with regard to the targets, geography, the population, the impacts. So domain of or the information exchange during this period must have been in very large scale. Same can be said about the West too, especially America, where Japanese knowing residents probably might have helped in deciphering the codes in those days. So before I thank the contributors to this module, let me just sum up. We have talked about the history of translation, and we have started with the traditions regarding translation in different countries. 2 countries which have been covered here are China and Japan. I would like to cover few more countries to come to the conclusion with regard to the traditions. Let me first thank here the contributors of this module. They are Priyanka Singh, Bindu Trahen and Shambhu Kumar. They helped in data collection and in the preliminary study. And before I thank you for bearing with me, please look for the module 2 for the continuation of translation traditions, and that will be the last edition. And if possible, would like to cover more, but Russian, French and Indian traditions would definitely be covered there. Thank you very much. This was Ashok Chawla.